the murdered chorus girl. A Miss Marple mystery spring had arrived in St. Mary Mead with its usual display of daffodils and cherry blossoms, transforming the quiet village into a picture postcard scene of rural England. The annual spring festival was being held that Saturday, and the villagers had spent weeks baking cakes, making flower garlands, and rehearsing songs for the most anticipated event of the year. Miss Jane Marple watched from her front garden as the villagers hurried past to the common field, laden with baskets and tablecloths. In her 70s, with her white hair neatly arranged and her blue eyes bright like a curious bird's, Miss Marple had the appearance of a harmless old woman devoted to her roses and her knitting. But those who knew her well knew that behind that amiable facade lay an extraordinarily sharp mind. "Good morning, Miss Marple," greeted the vicar, the Reverend Leonard Clement, pausing by her gate. "Will you be coming to the festival? The choir has been rehearsing for weeks. Young Timothy Ashford has an angelic voice. He'll be the principal soloist this afternoon." "I wouldn't miss it for the world, vicar," replied Miss Marple with a gentle smile, "although I must admit I'm a little worried about all this enthusiasm surrounding the boy." The vicar seemed surprised. "Enthusiasm? Well, that's natural. The boy has exceptional talent, miss. Blacklock has been very generous in offering him private singing lessons. She says he could have a professional career." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, but said nothing more. She had observed Timothy Ashford for the past few months, a 16-year-old boy with golden curls and a voice that indeed seemed heavenly. But she had also noticed other things. The intense glances cast upon him by Mrs. Helena Blacklock, the wealthy widow who had arrived in the village a year ago. The visible tension on the face of the boy's mother, Sarah Ashford, and the way the school music teacher, Mr. Edmund Craddock, regarded Timothy with a peculiar mixture of pride and something else Miss Marple couldn't quite identify. Jealousy, perhaps, or something darker. But these were only vague impressions, the kind a nosy old woman might have. Miss Marple scolded herself for letting her imagination run wild like that. The festival began at 2 in the afternoon with a cake-baking competition, followed by traditional games and races for the children. Miss Marple settled herself in a garden chair under the shade of a centuries-old oak tree, from where she could observe the entire festivities. Her niece, Raymond West, and his wife, Joan, had accompanied her from London for the occasion. "This is charmingly quaint, Aunt Jane," Joan remarked, biting into a piece of apple pie. "Like something from another era." "Appearances can be deceiving, my dear," murmured Miss Marple, her eyes following Timothy Ashford, who was chatting animatedly with a group of girls near the lemonade stand. "Even in the quietest places, human passions simmer just beneath the surface." At 4 o'clock, the choir assembled on the makeshift stage. Timothy Ashford, dressed in an immaculate white robe, took his place in the center. Reverend Clement gave a brief introduction, and the music began. Timothy's voice rose above the others, pure and crystalline, transforming the traditional hymn into something transcendent. Miss Marple observed the audience's reactions. Mrs. Blacklock, sitting in the front row, her eyes closed in ecstasy. Sarah Ashford, standing to one side, her hands clasped and her face tense. Mr. Craddock conducting the choir with stiff, almost mechanical movements. And Timothy's father, John Ashford, a stout man with the calloused hands of a manual laborer, who stared at his son with an inscrutable expression. He also noticed other people. The young doctor, Haydock, newly arrived in town, who was watching Timothy with obvious admiration. Miss Lavinia Price, the town spinster, whose face showed a strange mixture of disapproval and fascination. And Colonel Melchett, the local magistrate, who seemed bored and consulted his pocket watch repeatedly. When the song ended, the applause was deafening. Timothy bowed, his face lighting up with a radiant smile. He looked, Miss Marple thought, like a completely innocent child enjoying his moment of glory. But there was something about the way his eyes quickly scanned the crowd, lingering briefly on certain individuals, that suggested a more calculating consciousness than one might expect. "The intermission will be 20 minutes," announced the vicar. "The choir will offer its second number at 4:30. The crowd dispersed towards the refreshment and pastry stalls." Miss Marple watched Timothy slip away from the stage, heading towards the trees that bordered the common. Almost immediately, Mrs. Blacklock followed him, her pace unusually brisk for a woman her age. "How curious," murmured Miss Marple. "What's so strange, Auntie?" Raymond asked distractedly. "Oh, nothing, dear, just a silly old woman worrying about trivial things." But his eyes remained fixed on the line of trees. 5 minutes later, Sarah Ashford also headed in that direction, followed shortly after by Mr. Craddock. Miss Marple frowned. It was as if they all had urgent matters to discuss with the boy, and yet none of them seemed aware of each other's presence. When it was time for the choir to resume their performance, Timothy did not appear. Reverend Clement took to the stage, visibly disturbed. "It seems we've had a slight setback. Timothy appears to have left the room for a moment. I'm sure he'll be back any minute. In the meantime, perhaps we could—" "Vicar, vicar!" Miss Lavinia Price's hysterical voice cut through the air. The woman emerged from the trees, staggering, her face as white as chalk. "It's Timothy! He's dead! Someone has killed him!" Chaos erupted immediately. Several women screamed, men ran for the trees, and children were hurriedly pulled away by their mothers. Miss Marple remained seated, carefully observing everyone's reaction. Sarah Ashford let out a heart-rending wail and collapsed to the floor. Her husband John rushed to her side, but his face showed more shock than pain. Mr. Craddock stood frozen by the stage, his mouth open in a perfect "Oh, Mrs." Blacklock clutched her heart and slumped in her chair, though Miss Marple noticed that her eyes remained open and alert, following the movements of the others. Dr. Haydock was one of the first to arrive. Miss Marple, with the help of her walking stick, got up and followed the crowd, ignoring Joan's protests. "Aunt Jane, you shouldn't." "Nonsense, my dear. An old woman might be of help." Timothy Ashford's body lay in a small clearing, barely visible from the common field. He was lying face up, his white robe stained with blood that flowed from a wound in his left side. His blue eyes remained open, staring at the sky with an expression of surprise. "Doctor!" Haydock knelt beside the body, feeling the neck for a pulse. "He's dead," he announced gravely. "Just a few minutes ago, I'd say. The blood is still fresh." "How did he die?" asked Colonel Melchett, who had automatically assumed control of the situation with the authority of a magistrate. "Stabbed," the doctor replied, pointing to the wound. "One single blow, straight to the heart. Almost instant death." "Where is the weapon?" asked the colonel, looking around. There was no knife in sight. Colonel Melchett ordered that no one touch anything and sent Constable Polk, the local policeman, to immediately summon Inspector Slack from Much Benham. Miss Marple observed the scene with meticulous care. The body lay about 30 yards from the festival, far enough away that a scream wouldn't be heard over the music and conversations. The ground around it was covered with dry leaves from the previous winter, and a few wild daffodils. She noticed several things. First, the body position. Timothy had fallen backward, suggesting that he had seen his attacker coming, or at least faced him. Second, there were no signs of a struggle. His hands were clean, without defensive scratches. Third, something was shining on the ground about 2 meters from the body. Miss Marple approached cautiously. "Colonel Melchett," he called softly, "could you take a look at this?" It was a gold brooch in the shape of a lily, delicate and clearly expensive. "Don't touch it, Miss Marple," warned the colonel, but he had already bent down to examine it. A woman's brooch. It could be an important clue. Miss Marple nodded, but her mind was already racing. She had seen that brooch before, very recently. Where? "Everyone must return to the camp," ordered Colonel Melchett. "No one is to leave the festival until Inspector Slack arrives and takes statements." The crowd began to disperse, murmuring in shock. Miss Marple walked slowly back, observing the people around her. Mrs. Blacklock had recovered from her faint, and was now sitting up, being attended to by several women from the village. Miss Marple noticed that her right hand was trembling slightly as she held a glass of water, but her left hand, which rested in her lap, was perfectly still. Curious. Sarah Ashford sobbed hysterically, surrounded by neighbors trying to comfort her. Her husband, John, stood some distance away, staring gloomily at the trees. Mr. Craddock had disappeared. Miss Marple looked around and finally located him, sitting alone on a distant bench, with his head in his hands. Miss Lavinia Price, the woman who had discovered the body, was being questioned by Colonel Melchett. Her voice, though trembling, was clear. "I had gone to get my handkerchief. I thought I had dropped it near the trees during the first choir number. And then I saw her white robe among the bushes. At first I thought she was resting, but when I got closer, she shuddered and could not continue." "Did you see anyone else in the area?" the colonel asked. "No, nobody. I was completely alone when I found him." Miss Marple pondered this. Was it possible that Miss Price could have passed by there just after the murder without encountering the killer? Time was of the essence, unless... Inspector Slack arrived 40 minutes later, a robust man with a mustache and brusque manner. He immediately began questioning those present, starting with those who had been closest to Timothy. Miss Marple settled herself back into her chair under the oak tree, seemingly engrossed in her knitting, but with her ears wide open to any conversation she might overhear. Raymond approached with a cup of tea. "This is awful, Aunt Jane. Such a young boy with his whole life ahead of him." "Yes, it's a tragedy," Miss Marple agreed. "Although I wonder, Raymond, my dear, do you remember 4 years ago when you were working on that story about the financial scandal? The man who seemed so respectable but had been deceiving his investors for years." Raymond blinked at the apparent change of subject. "Yes, of course. Henderson, his name was. Why do you mention him?" "Just remembering how appearances can be deceiving. He was such a charming man, so respectable on the surface. And yet—" He left the sentence unfinished, his eyes fixed on Sarah Ashford, who was now talking quietly to Inspector Slack. Inspector Slack had established his base of operations at the vicarage, and one by one he called in the witnesses for questioning. Miss Marple, under the pretext of helping Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, prepare tea for everyone, managed to be present during several of these interrogations. Sarah Ashford was the first to be formally questioned. Timothy's mother was pale but more composed now, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mrs. Ashford," began Inspector Slack, his tone professional but not insensitive, "I am deeply sorry for your loss, but I must ask you a few questions." "I understand, Inspector," Sarah replied in a barely audible voice. "When did you last see your son?" "After the first number. I saw him come down from the stage. I thought he was going to get some water or get ready for the next number." "Did he follow him?" There was a barely perceptible pause. "Not immediately, but after a few minutes I went to find him. I wanted to talk to him about something." "About what?" Sarah Ashford lowered her gaze. "Family matters, nothing important. Mrs. Ashford, your son has been murdered." "Everything is important now." The woman looked up, and Miss Marple saw something in her eyes, fear, but also determination. "I was worried about him, about the attention he was receiving. Certain people had become very close to Timothy, Too close. I wanted to warn him to be more cautious. Which people? Mrs. Blacklock, to begin with. Oh, I know you've been very generous, offering free lessons and talking about paying for his musical education in London. But there's something inappropriate about the way you look at him, the way you always find excuses to be alone with him. That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Ashford. I'm not accusing anyone of murder. I'm just saying I was concerned about the influence she was having on my son. Timothy had changed in the last few months. He'd become secretive, distant. He spent more time with Mrs. Blacklock than with his own family.
And were you able to speak with him this afternoon?
Another pause. No. When I got to the trees, I couldn't find him. I called his name, but he didn't answer. I assumed he'd gone somewhere else, so I went back to the festival. What time was it? I'm not sure. Maybe 4:10, 4:15. Did you see anyone else in that area? No. Well, when I was coming back, I saw Mr. Craddock walking in that direction, but I didn't pay much attention to him. Inspector Slack took note of this and dismissed Sarah Ashford. Miss Marple watched the woman leave the room. She was lying, of that she was certain, or at least hiding something. But what? The next to be questioned was John Ashford. Timothy's father was a man of few words, with the large, calloused hands of someone who worked hard for his living. He was a carpenter by trade, and known in the village for his calm temperament. Mr. Ashford, where were you during the intermission? At my stall. I sell my woodworking at the festival every year. I was showing some shelves to Colonel Melchett when we heard the shouting. What was your relationship with your son? John Ashford frowned. He was my son. What more is there to say? Were you close? Timothy was a good lad. Maybe a little delicate for my taste, all that singing business. I wanted him to learn an honest trade, but Sarah insisted he develop his talent. Did you disapprove of the singing lessons? It's not that I disapproved of them. I was just wondering what purpose they served. Singing doesn't put food on the table. But if it made the boy happy, I didn't object. What did you think of Mrs. Blacklock? The question seemed to surprise John Ashford. The rich widow? I don't know her very well. She seems like a decent woman, generous with Timothy. Weren't you bothered by the amount of time your son spent with her? For the first time, John Ashford showed emotion. His hands clenched into fists. Look, Inspector, if you're implying something inappropriate, just say so. Yes, there were times when I wondered why a woman with no children of her own was so interested in my son. But Timothy assured me it was all perfectly appropriate. They were just singing lessons. Did you believe him? He was my son. I had to believe him. After John Ashford withdrew, the inspector turned to Colonel Melchett. Interesting. It seems several people had concerns about this Mrs. Blacklock. She'll be next. Miss Marple cleared her throat softly from her corner. If you'll allow me, Inspector, I believe I should also speak with Mr. Craddock, the music teacher. I understand he was seen near the crime scene around the time of the murder. Inspector Slack looked at her with a touch of irritation. He didn't like receiving advice, especially from meddlesome old women. But Miss Marple gave him such a sweet, innocent smile that he couldn't take offense. All in good time, Miss Marple. All in good time. Helena Blacklock entered the vicarage with the elegance of someone accustomed to the finest salons. She was a woman of about 50, well-preserved, with dark hair barely flecked with gray and piercing green eyes. She dressed with evident good taste, and her jewelry, though discreet, was clearly expensive. Miss Marple immediately noticed that the lily brooch they had found near the body was no longer on her lapel. "Inspector Slack," Mrs. Blacklock said in a controlled voice, "this is a terrible situation. Poor Timothy. He was such a talented boy, so full of promise. Mrs. Blacklock, I understand that you were sponsoring young Timothy Ashford. Sponsorship is such a formal word. I simply recognized his exceptional talent and wanted to help him develop it. I'm a widow, Inspector, and have no children of my own. My late husband left a considerable fortune. Why not use it for something meaningful? What exactly was the nature of your relationship with Timothy? Mrs. Blacklock raised an eyebrow. I'm his singing teacher, nothing more. We met 3 times a week for lessons. I had plans to send him to the Royal Academy of Music in London. His potential was limitless. And did your parents approve of this? Sarah was delighted. John is a practical man, a hard worker. I suppose he found it difficult to grasp the value of art, but he wasn't actively opposed to it. Where were you during the festival break? Initially, I stayed in my seat enjoying the sun. Then I decided to congratulate Timothy personally on his performance. I went toward the stage, but he had already left. Someone told me they had seen him heading toward the trees, so I went in that direction. And did you find it? There was an infinitesimal pause before he answered. No. I walked a little way through the trees, calling his name, but got no answer. I figured he wanted to be alone to mentally prepare for the second number. Performers sometimes need solitude before an important performance, so I went back to the festival. What time was this? Around 4 or 5, maybe 4:10. Did you see anyone else in that area? No. Or wait. Yes. I saw Sarah Ashford coming out from behind the trees as I was walking in. We exchanged a glance, but we didn't speak. She's never been particularly friendly to me. Inspector Slack consulted his notes. Mrs. Ashford says she didn't find Timothy in the trees. You say the same thing, and yet minutes later, Miss Price found him dead. Are either of you lying, Mrs.? Blacklock became rigid. Inspector, I told you the truth. If Sarah Ashford lied, you'll have to ask her why. There's something else, Mrs. Blacklock. A brooch was found near the body. A gold lily brooch. Mrs. Blacklock's face paled slightly, but her voice remained firm. Yes, it's mine. I noticed it was missing this afternoon. It must have fallen when I was looking for Timothy. Or during a confrontation with him, the inspector suggested. That's absurd. Why would I confront Timothy? He was my protégé, She stopped abruptly. What, Mrs. Blacklock? My hope for the future, she finished softly. I saw in him an opportunity to create something beautiful, to leave a legacy. His death is devastating for me. After Mrs. Blacklock withdrew, Inspector Slack turned to Colonel Melchett. There's something he's not telling us. And that story about the brooch is too convenient. Miss Marple, who had remained silent, finally spoke. Inspector, if I may offer a silly old woman's observation, I've noticed that when people lie about small things, they're often hiding bigger truths. Mrs. Blacklock admitted the brooch was hers, which would have been easy to verify anyway. But her description of her relationship with Timothy, that's where I think she was less than truthful. What do you suggest, Miss Marple? Nothing specific, Inspector. Only that a lonely widowed woman who finds a talented young man. Emotions can be complicated. I had a friend once, Mrs. Sanders, who became very attached to her gardener's son. She said it was only because of his talent for painting. But we could all see it was something more. A mixture of frustrated maternal affection and perhaps something more unsettling. The boy, of course, took full advantage of the situation. Inspector Slack frowned, considering this. Are you suggesting that Timothy was manipulating Mrs. Blacklock? I'm not suggesting anything, Inspector. Just remembering. But young people are sometimes more cunning than they appear, especially when they see an opportunity to improve their circumstances. Very well. Bring in Mr. Craddock. Edmund Craddock was a man of about 35, thin to the point of looking gaunt, with thinning blonde hair and watery blue eyes behind thick glasses. His hands trembled visibly as he sat down opposite the inspector. Mr. Craddock, you're the music teacher at the local school, correct? Yes, I've been teaching here for 5 years. And you were the one who first discovered Timothy Ashford's talent. Craddock's voice became more animated. Yes, indeed. I heard him sing in class 3 years ago and knew immediately he had something special. I started giving him extra lessons after school, free of charge. He was my special project. Until Mrs. Blacklock got involved? Craddock's face darkened. She ruined everything. She showed up with her money and her connections, and suddenly I wasn't enough for Timothy anymore. He discarded me as if I hadn't done anything for him. It must have bothered him a lot. Of course it bothered me. I had invested 3 years in that boy. I had discovered him, trained him, molded him, and then she came along and took him away. How close were you to Timothy? Craddock hesitated. He was my student. A very talented student. Nothing more than that. What are you implying, Inspector? I'm just trying to understand the nature of their relationship. Craddock took off his glasses and cleaned them with trembling hands. Timothy was special, not just because of his voice, but because of his personality. He was charming, intelligent, perceptive. I enjoyed his company. Is that a crime? It depends on what else that company would entail. Nothing inappropriate happened. Craddock's voice rose to almost a shout. Nothing inappropriate ever happened. I respected boundaries. Always. And did Timothy respect those limits? Craddock remained silent, his face now red. Mr. Craddock, you were seen walking toward the trees during the break. Why were you there? I needed to talk to Timothy about the second issue. I wanted to make sure he was ready. Couldn't he have waited for me to return? No, it was urgent. I wanted to. She stopped. What did you want, Mr. Craddock? I wanted to ask you to consider declining Mrs. Blacklock's offer. Going to London to the Royal Academy would take you away from St. Mary Mead. I thought you could stay, continue your studies here, perhaps eventually teach with me. But Timothy didn't want that, did he? Craddock shook his head, defeated. No. When I found him among the trees, he laughed at me. He said I was a pathetic fool, that I would never waste my talent staying in an insignificant town with a mediocre teacher. He said Mrs. Blacklock had promised him the world, and that he would take it. And how did you react to that? I felt devastated, humiliated. I told him he was ungrateful, that without me he would never have gotten anywhere. He just laughed harder. So, what happened then? I left. I left him there, laughing, and I left. I walked among the trees, trying to calm down. I was so angry, so hurt, but I didn't kill him, Inspector. I didn't kill him. What time was this? I don't know exactly. Maybe 4 or 5. When I heard the screams, I was still in the trees, on the opposite side of the clearing. I ran back with everyone else. Did you see anyone else when you left Timothy? No. Wait. As I was walking away, I saw a figure in the distance among the trees. I couldn't make out who it was, but there was definitely someone there. Man or woman? I couldn't say. I only saw a silhouette. After Craddock withdrew, clearly distressed, Colonel Melchett shook his head. We have 3 people who admit to having been near the crime scene, all around the same time, and yet none of them saw the others or found Timothy alive. Someone is lying, said Inspector Slack. Or perhaps everyone is lying. Miss Marple, who had listened to everything attentively, intervened gently. Inspector, if I may, I believe Mr. Craddock is telling the truth, at least in essence. His reaction is entirely understandable. I had a great-nephew who fell hopelessly in love with his piano teacher. When she married someone else, the poor fellow was absolutely devastated. Devotion, when rejected, can turn to bitterness. But that doesn't necessarily lead to murder. So who killed him? The colonel asked, exasperated. That, dear Colonel, is the question, replied Miss Marple. But I believe we haven't yet heard all the relevant accounts. What about Miss Price? Who found the body? Her timing is curiously convenient. Miss Lavinia Price was a thin, nervous, middle-aged woman with the kind of face that always seemed disapproving. She was known in St. Mary Mead for being extremely religious and for having strong opinions about the town's morals. Miss Price, began Inspector Slack, you were the one who discovered the body. Tell me exactly what happened. It was horrible, simply horrible, said Miss Price, twisting a handkerchief in her hands. I'll never forget the sight. That poor boy, so young, lying there in all that blood. Yes, I understand it was upsetting, but I need you to tell me the facts. Miss Price took a deep breath. As I told Colonel Melchett, I had lost my handkerchief. I thought I had dropped it near the trees during the first choir number. I had been standing there, you see, because there were no seats available. So during the intermission, I went to look for it. And what time was it? It must have been 4:20, maybe 4:25. I had been having tea, so it was a little later than when others went to that area. Did you see anyone when you went there? No, I didn't see anyone. Everything was very quiet. I walked among the trees looking for my handkerchief, and then I saw Timothy's white robe. At first, I thought he was resting, like I said before. But when I got closer, she shuddered and brought the handkerchief to her lips. Did he touch anything? No! Well, I touched him, his hand, to see if it was, but it was cold. Then I ran back screaming. Miss Price, I must ask you something delicate. I understand that you have expressed concern about Timothy Ashford in the past. Miss Price stiffened. I don't know what you're referring to. I've been told that you commented to several people in the town that Timothy's behavior was questionable. Well, it was true, said Miss Price, raising her chin defensively. That boy had become quite boastful and manipulative. I've lived at St. Mary Mead all my life, Inspector, and I can recognize someone of dubious character when I see them. What exactly do you mean by that? Timothy Ashford had learned to use his charm and talent to get what he wanted. He flirted outrageously with Mrs. Blacklock, getting her to buy him things and promising her his devotion. At the same time, he kept poor Mr. Craddock on a tight leash, accepting his lessons and attentions. And at home, I understand, he constantly manipulated his mother against his father. Miss Marple, who until now had remained silent, spoke. Lavinia, my dear, those are very serious accusations against a dead boy. Do you have proof of this behavior? Miss Price turned to Miss Marple. Jane, you know as well as I do how human nature works. I've seen this kind of behavior before. I had a cousin Edgar who was exactly the same, handsome, charming, and completely immoral. He used people until they were no longer useful to him, and then discarded them without remorse. And what happened to that cousin? Asked Miss Marple with apparent innocence. He died young, Miss Price replied sharply. Under suspicious circumstances. Some said one of his victims had finally taken revenge. How interesting, murmured Miss Marple. Inspector Slack intervened. Miss Price, are you suggesting that Timothy deserved to die? Of course not. No Christian would ever say such a thing. But I can't pretend he was an angel just because he's dead. If you're looking for reasons, Inspector, there were plenty of people Timothy had used or humiliated. Including you? Miss Price blushed. I barely knew the boy. I was simply observing, as any responsible member of the community would. After Miss Price left, Inspector Slack looked frustrated. Every person I question gives me more reasons why Timothy Ashford should be dead, but no one admits to killing him. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. It's curious, isn't it, Inspector? Everyone talks about Timothy as if he were a petty villain, manipulative and calculating. And yet he was only 16. I wonder how much of this is true, and how much is a projection of their own guilt and frustrations. What do you mean? Well, consider it. Mrs. Blacklock admits she was deeply attached to Timothy. Mr. Craddock was obviously devoted to him. Sarah Ashford was worried about losing him. Even John Ashford, in his laconic way, seemed to have complex feelings about his son. When people feel strong emotions about someone, sometimes those emotions can become dangerous, especially if they are rejected or frustrated. So, you believe the murder was a crime of passion? Oh, certainly, replied Miss Marple. The manner of the crime suggests it. A single blow, straight to the heart. It wasn't carefully premeditated. It was an impulsive act born of overwhelming emotion. Rage, jealousy, fear, despair. One of these, or perhaps all of them together. Colonel Melchett cleared his throat. So, according to your theory, Miss Marple, which of our suspects had that overwhelming emotion? Ah, said Miss Marple with a gentle smile. That is the question, isn't it? But I believe we haven't heard everyone yet. There is one more person whose perspective might be enlightening. Who? Dr. Haydock. He's new to town, which means he has fresh eyes, free from the prejudices of years of shared history. And he was at the festival. Perhaps he noticed something others missed. Doctor, Haydock was a young man, no more than 30 years old, with dark hair and a straightforward manner that inspired confidence. He had arrived at St. Mary Mead just 6 months earlier to take over the practice of the elderly doctor who was retiring. Dr. Haydock, said Inspector Slack, you examined the body. Can you tell us anything more about the time of death? Based on the body temperature and the state of the blood, I would say Timothy died between 4:10 and 4:25. I can't be more precise than that without a full autopsy. And the wound? A single blow with a knife or similar instrument penetrating the heart. Death would have been almost instantaneous. Whoever did it knew exactly where to aim, or was very lucky. Could a woman have inflicted such a wound? Absolutely. It doesn't require excessive force if the weapon is sharp enough and the angle is right. A determined woman could do it easily. Doctor, you're relatively new to the town. From your outsider's perspective, what can you tell us about the people involved? Haydock considered the question carefully. I don't pretend to know as much as the long-time residents, but I have made a few observations. Mrs. Blacklock is a lonely woman who was clearly trying to fill a void in her life. Timothy represented that for her, a sort of surrogate son, though I suspect her feelings were more complicated than simple maternal affection. Continue. Mr. Craddock is obviously a tormented man, with intense feelings that he probably doesn't fully understand himself. Sarah Ashford is, well, there's something about her I can't quite put my finger on. She loves her son, that much is clear, but there's something else there too. Fear, perhaps. Or guilt. Guilty for what? I couldn't say. Just an impression. And the father, John Ashford, is simpler. An honest, hard-working man who found himself with a son he couldn't understand. I think there was love there, but also a kind of bewilderment, even resentment. Did you notice anything unusual during the festival? Yes, actually. During the first number, when Timothy was singing, I watched the faces in the audience. Most showed simple admiration. But there were others. Mrs. Blacklock had an expression of almost painful longing. Mr. Craddock seemed on the verge of tears. Sarah Ashford looked proud, but also worried. And Miss Price? What about Miss Price? She looked at him with what I can only describe as disgust. Not admiration, not pride, but something close to hatred. Miss Marple leaned forward. That's an interesting observation, Doctor. I noticed that too. I wonder why. There's more, Haydock continued. During the intermission, I saw Timothy briefly. He seemed agitated. Not the composed young man who had been on stage. He was talking to someone, though I couldn't see who in the crowd. But his body language was defensive, almost confrontational. What time was this? Right after the end of the first issue, around 4 o'clock. Minutes later, I saw him heading towards the trees. Alone? Yes, but I had the impression he was expecting to meet someone there. He kept looking behind him, as if checking if someone was following him. And you didn't think about following him? Why would I do that? He was just a kid going somewhere during break time. I had no reason to think he was in danger." Inspector Slack consulted his notes. "There's something I don't understand. We have multiple people who admit to going into the trees to look for Timothy. Mrs. Blacklock says it was around 4 or 5. Sarah Ashford says much the same. Mr. Craddock, too. And yet, none of them met the others, and they all say they didn't find Timothy. But Miss Price found him dead at 4:20 or 25. "Which means," said Colonel Melchett, "that Timothy was killed within a very narrow interval, and that one of our witnesses must be lying about when they were there." Miss Marple cleared her throat gently. "Or perhaps they're not lying about the moment, but about what they saw and heard. Sometimes people see things without realizing their significance until later. What do you suggest, Miss Marple? But perhaps we should ask ourselves what each person gained from Timothy's death. Not just who was angry with him, but who benefited from his death." Inspector Slack frowned. "Benefit? He was a 16-year-old boy from a modest family. He had no money, no property. Who could possibly benefit?" "Ah," said Miss Marple, "but he had something more valuable than money. He had information. He had power over people through what he knew about them. And he had a future that, if realized, would change the lives of many people. Explain yourself." "Well, consider this. If Timothy went to London with Mrs. Blacklock, she would have had control over him. She would have been an intimate part of his life. But it would also have meant considerable expense. What if Timothy wasn't all he seemed? What if Mrs. Blacklock had discovered something about him that made her investment seem unwise? Are you suggesting that Mrs. Blacklock killed him to avoid being manipulated any longer?" "I'm not suggesting anything specific, Inspector. Just exploring possibilities. But consider Mr. Craddock as well. If Timothy left, Mr. Craddock would lose his obsession, his reason for living, you might say. That could provoke enough desperation to lead to a violent act. And Sarah Ashford? A mother always has complex reasons for her actions. Perhaps she was protecting Timothy from something. Or perhaps she was protecting herself." "This is too vague," said Inspector Slack in frustration. "We need concrete evidence, not psychological speculation." "The evidence is there," Miss Marple said calmly. "We just need to look in the right place." "Inspector, has the murder weapon been found?" "No, we've searched the area, but there are no knives. That's very revealing. It means the killer carried it with him. And carrying a bloody knife undetected requires planning. It must have been wrapped in something. A handkerchief, a scarf, perhaps a bag. Or he could have hidden it somewhere in the trees. Possible, but risky. A thorough search would eventually uncover it." "No, I think the killer took it because it had particular significance. It wasn't a random weapon grabbed in a moment of passion, but something the killer had brought with him, which suggests at least some premeditation." Colonel Melchett seemed impressed despite himself. "Miss Marple, for someone who professes to be just an old woman who knits, has an extraordinarily sharp mind for crime." Miss Marple smiled modestly. "Oh, I've lived in small towns all my life, Colonel, and I've learned that beneath the respectable surface, human passions are the same as anywhere else, only better hidden. But there are always signs if you know where to look." The next morning, Miss Marple woke up early as usual. After breakfast, she decided to take a walk around the village. She often found that her best ideas came during a leisurely stroll. St. Mary Mead was unusually quiet. Timothy's death had cast a shadow over the village. Curtains remained drawn in many houses, and the few villagers who were out spoke in whispers. Miss Marple deliberately walked along the main street, stopping at the village shop to buy wool. Mrs. Bantry, Colonel Bantry's wife, and a close friend of hers, was there. "Jane, have you heard anything else? Has Inspector Slack arrested anyone?" "Not that I know of, Dolly. These things take time. But it's terrible, simply terrible. To think there's a killer walking among us. I won't feel safe until they catch the culprit. I don't think you have anything to fear, my dear. This was a very personal crime, not the work of a random killer.
Do you mean it was someone who knew Timothy?
Oh, definitely. And probably someone who knew him very well. After buying her wool, Miss Marple continued her walk, this time heading towards the church. She wanted to see the place where Timothy had sung his last song. Reverend Clement was in the cemetery, clearly distressed. Miss Marple, this is a terrible tragedy. I've just spoken to the Ashfords. The funeral will be on Thursday. How are you coping? Sarah is devastated, as expected. John is, well, he's a practical man. He does what needs to be done. But I can see he's suffering too. Vicario, did you know Timothy well? As well as I know any young man in my parish. He came to church regularly, sang in the choir. He seemed like a good boy. Did it seem so? The vicar hesitated. Miss Marple, I don't mean to speak ill of the dead, but in the last few months I've noticed a change in Timothy. A certain arrogance, perhaps, as if he knew he had power over people and enjoyed wielding it. Did you tell him anything about this? I tried. About 3 weeks ago, we had a conversation after choir rehearsal. I suggested to him that humility was an important Christian virtue, especially for someone blessed with so much talent. And how did he react? He laughed. He told me that humility was for the weak and that he had no intention of being weak. He said he was going to use every advantage he had to get out of this insignificant town and do something important with his life. Harsh words from such a young boy. Yes, I was worried about him, Miss Marple. I was worried that his ambition would lead him astray. But I never imagined it would lead him to this. Miss Marple thanked the vicar and continued her walk, reflecting on what she had learned. Timothy had clearly been more complex than he appeared on the surface. An angel on stage, but perhaps something very different of it. As he passed the Ashford house, he noticed John Ashford in his workshop, working on a piece of wood. He decided to stop. Mr. Ashford, I am so sorry for your loss. John Ashford looked up, his face tired. Gracias, Miss Marple. Can I ask you a question? It's about Timothy. I suppose the whole town is talking about him. I'm afraid so, Mr. Ashford. Did your son keep a diary or letters? Anything that might shed some light on what was happening in his life? John Ashford frowned. Sarah mentioned something about a diary. Timothy kept it hidden, but she found it once while cleaning her room. She was disgusted by what she read, but when I asked her, she wouldn't tell me. She said it was just teenage fantasies. Do you know where that diary is now? You should be in your room. Why? Do you think it's important? It could be, Mr. Ashford. Would you allow Inspector Slack to search for you? If you help find who killed my son, you can search for whatever you want. Miss Marple thanked him and hurried back to the vicarage, where she knew Inspector Slack was working. She found him reviewing statements with Colonel Melchett. Inspector, I think you should search Timothy Ashford's room. Specifically, look for a diary. Inspector Slack seemed skeptical but agreed. An hour later, he returned with a small black leather-bound book. We found him hiding under the floorboards. Let's see what secrets our angelic choir boy was keeping. What they read was both revealing and disturbing. Timothy Ashford's diary covered the last 6 months. It was written in an elegant, almost feminine handwriting, and the entries revealed a mind far more calculating than anyone had imagined. Inspector Slack read aloud selected passages. October 15, Mrs. B is completely smitten with me. It's pathetic, really, a woman her age behaving like a schoolgirl. But it's useful. She's promised to pay my tuition at the Royal Academy. All I have to do is smile and act as if her attention is welcome. It's a small price to pay for my future. November 3. Mr. C is becoming a problem. His feelings are so obvious, I'm surprised no one else notices. Today, after my lesson, he tried to... Well, it was quite unpleasant. I had to threaten to tell the principal if he tried it again. Now he's terrified. Good. Fear keeps him useful and quiet. December 22. Mom is starting to get suspicious about Mrs. B. She keeps asking questions about the lessons. I'll have to be more careful. The last thing I need is for her to cause trouble. Dad is easier to deal with. He just doesn't care enough to pay attention. January 14. Miss P caught me talking to Evelyn Fletcher behind the church. Her expression was one of pure indignation. These nosy old women think everyone should live up to their prudish standards. I smiled at her and said good morning, which seemed to enrage her even more. It's almost funny how much she hates me. March 8. I discovered something interesting about Mrs. B. She is not the respectable widow she pretends to be. Her late husband actually left her for another woman. She simply says he died because it is less shameful. I could use this information if she ever tries to go back on her promises. April 20. Mr. C confessed his feelings to me today. It was so ridiculously dramatic. I told him I appreciated his friendship, but nothing more. He cried. He literally cried. It's weak and pathetic, but as long as he keeps giving me brilliant references for the academy, I'll tolerate it. May 2. Mom found my diary. Luckily, she only read a few pages before I got back. She was horrified. She called me manipulative and cruel. I told her I was just being practical, using the resources available to me to achieve my goals. She didn't understand, of course. She never has. She's trapped in this miserable town, in this miserable marriage, and she can't stand that I want something better. The last entry was from the day of the festival. May 5th. Today is the big day. After my performance, all the talk will be about me. Mrs. B has promised to publicly announce her sponsorship. Mr. C is still trying to convince me to stay, but I will decline his offer this afternoon, definitely. Mother has been acting strangely paranoid, but I can't worry about that now. Nothing will stand in my way. Silence filled the room as Inspector Slack finished reading. My God, said Colonel Melchett, the boy was a little monster. Miss Marple shook her head sadly. Not a monster, Colonel. Just a young man desperate to escape the limitations of his life. Unfortunately, he chose methods that hurt the people who wanted to help him. This gives any of our suspects an even stronger motive, said Inspector Slack. Mrs. Blacklock, if she discovered that Timothy knew her secret and could use it against her. Mr. Craddock, if Timothy cruelly rejected him that afternoon, as the diary says. Sarah Ashford, if she was trying to protect him from himself, or perhaps protect herself from what he might reveal about her. What could Timothy possibly reveal about his own mother? The Colonel asked. I don't know, but he mentions that his marriage is miserable. Perhaps there were family problems we don't know about. Miss Marple had remained silent, but now she spoke. Inspector, may I take a closer look at that diary? She handed him the book. Miss Marple leafed through it slowly, examining not only the words, but also the paper, the binding, the way it was written. Interesting, he murmured. Very interesting. What is it, Miss Marple? This diary, Inspector. It's too perfect, too convenient. Every page provides clear motives for our prime suspects, almost as if it was written to be found. Are you suggesting it's fake? Not necessarily false, but perhaps exaggerated. Or perhaps Timothy wasn't writing his true thoughts, but a kind of narrative, almost as if he were preparing for something. Preparing for what? That's the question, isn't it? But notice the last entry. Nothing will stand in my way. Those are the words of someone confident, not someone afraid. And yet, a few hours later, he was dead. What are you saying? I'm saying that Timothy might have known he was in danger. Or at least, he suspected someone might try to stop him. And perhaps this journal was his way of leaving evidence in case something happened to him. Inspector Slack considered this. So, who was I exposing? To everyone. But especially to one person, I think. The person who had the most to lose if Timothy revealed his secrets. And who is that person? Miss Marple smiled gently. I think we need to conduct a small test. Inspector, could you summon all our prime suspects to the vicarage tomorrow afternoon? Tell them there's been a development in the case. What type of development? You'll see, Inspector, you'll see. The next day at 3 in the afternoon, the vicarage hall was filled with tense people. Mrs. Blacklock, Sarah and John Ashford, Mr. Craddock, Miss Price, and Dr. Haydock were all present, along with Inspector Slack, Colonel Melchett, Reverend Clement, and Miss Marple. Thank you all for coming, began Inspector Slack. I have called this meeting because I have discovered significant information related to the death of Timothy Ashford. Everyone remained silent, expectant. We've found Timothy's diary. It contains revelations about several people in this room. There were muffled gasps. Mrs. Blacklock turned pale. Mr. Craddock began to tremble visibly. However, the inspector continued, before revealing the contents of the diary, I want to ask a question. Did any of you know about the existence of this diary? Silence. Very well. Let me read some passages. As the inspector read selections from the diary, the reactions were instructive. Mrs. Blacklock closed her eyes, her face a mask of pain. Mr. Craddock looked as if he were about to faint. Sarah Ashford was sobbing silently. John Ashford remained motionless, his face impassive. Miss Price appeared simultaneously pleased and horrified. As you can see, the inspector said when he finished, Timothy meticulously documented his relationships with each of you. He also documented information that could be embarrassing if made public. Are you implying that one of us killed him to silence him? Mrs. Blacklock asked, her voice trembling but defiant. It's a possibility we should consider. This is outrageous, said John Ashford, rising. My son is dead, and you're portraying him as a blackmailer. Sit down, Mr. Ashford, the inspector ordered. I'm not finished. Miss Marple, who had remained silent in her corner, finally spoke. If you'll allow me, Inspector, I think I can clarify a few things. Come in, Miss Marple. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this case. At first, it seemed simple. A young man was murdered by someone he had hurt or manipulated. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like something didn't add up. What didn't fit? The timing primarily. Timothy was murdered during a public festival break, in a place where multiple people could easily have seen or heard him. It's a terribly risky time to commit murder, unless the killer had no other choice. Or unless it was a crime of passion, the inspector pointed out. An impulsive act by someone pushed beyond their limits. Yes, that was my initial theory. But then I considered the weapon. No knife has been found. That suggests the killer planned it well enough to bring a weapon and then take it with him. That contradicts the impulse theory. So, what does that suggest? I suggest the murder was in fact planned, but not for the reasons we think. It wasn't to silence Timothy, but to... Why, Miss Marple? To free him. Or more precisely, to free someone else from his influence. I don't understand. Miss Marple looked around the room, her eyes lingering on each person. You see, we've all been assuming that Timothy was the manipulator, the person in power. And according to his diary, that was the case. But I asked myself a question. What if the real manipulator wasn't Timothy, but someone who was using him? Use Timothy? For what? To escape an impossible situation. Consider this. Timothy was a talented young man from a modest family, desperate to escape. He was ambitious, perhaps unscrupulous in his methods, but he was also young, vulnerable. An older, more experienced person could easily have manipulated him, convincing him that he was using others when, in fact, he was being used. By whom? Miss Marple turned to look directly at Sarah Ashford. For his mother. Sarah Ashford was speechless. That's absurd. I loved my son. Oh, I don't doubt it, Miss Marple said gently. But she was also desperate. trapped in a marriage to a man who didn't understand her, in a town that suffocated her. She saw in Timothy her chance of escape. If he succeeded, she could go with him to London, be free of John, of St. Mary Mead, of this whole life she had come to despise. "This is madness," said John Ashford, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is that so, Mr. Ashford? Or had you noticed that your wife had grown distant from you? That she spent all her time with Timothy, encouraging him, pushing him to be more ambitious, more ruthless?" John Ashford did not answer, but his face said it all. "Sarah guided Timothy," Miss Marple continued. "She taught him how to read people, how to manipulate them. She suggested he cultivate Mrs. Blacklock's devotion, keep Mr. Craddock in suspense. And Timothy, being young and impressionable, obeyed. He thought it was his own idea, his own clever plan. But it was she who was pulling the strings all along." "This is pure speculation," said Inspector Slack. "You have no proof." "Oh, but I have them. Remember the diary? I said it was too perfect, too convenient. That's because Timothy wasn't the only one writing in it." Miss Marple opened the diary to a specific page. "Look here. The handwriting changes subtly. Most of the entries are in Timothy's handwriting. Yes, but certain entries, including some of the most damning ones, are in a slightly different hand. More mature, more controlled. The handwriting of someone who had practiced imitating Timothy's." "Sarah," said John Ashford, his voice filled with horror. "Is this true?" Sarah Ashford did not respond. She had turned completely pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "But that doesn't explain who killed Timothy," Colonel Melchett pointed out. "Ah," said Miss Marple, "but he does." You see, Sarah realized that her plan was beginning to unravel. Timothy was becoming too confident, too arrogant. He was beginning to relish his power over others, and he wasn't so easily controlled anymore. Worse still, he was beginning to question his mother's motives. How does he know all this? Because Timothy told someone. Dr. Haydock mentioned that he saw Timothy talking to someone just before the intermission, and that he seemed agitated. I think he was talking to his mother, and that he was telling her he'd found out what she was doing, that he wouldn't be her puppet anymore. "And that sealed his fate," said Inspector Slack, beginning to understand. "Exactly." Sarah realized that if Timothy rebelled, her whole plan would fall apart. Mrs. Blacklock might back out of her offer. The truth about the manipulations might come to light. Her chance of escape would vanish, so she made a terrible decision. "She killed him, Mrs." Blacklock said in horror. "She killed her own son." "Yes." During the break, she asked Timothy to meet her in the trees. He went, perhaps expecting a final confrontation. But Sarah brought a kitchen knife from her house. When they met, she probably tried to reason with him one more time. When he refused, when he said he was going to expose everything she had done, she acted. "A single blow to the heart," murmured Dr. Haydock. "I would have had to be very close to him, someone he trusted." "Then," Miss Marple continued, "she wrapped the knife in her shawl and went back to the festival. The blood stains on her clothes would have been difficult to explain, but a dark shawl could conceal much. Later she disposed of the knife, probably in the river." Sarah Ashford finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "He was going to ruin everything we had worked for. I gave him everything, and he was going to throw it all away, stay in this horrible town, waste his talent. I couldn't let that happen." "So, you admit it?" asked Inspector Slack, standing up. "What difference does it make now?" Sarah said, her voice now louder, almost defiant. "Yes, I killed him, my own son. Are you happy now?" John Ashford groaned and slumped in his chair, his head in his hands. "Sarah Ashford," said Inspector Slack formally, "I'm arresting you for the murder of Timothy Ashford. You must be warned that." But Sarah was no longer listening. She stared blankly into space, her eyes empty, as if she were already in a very distant place. 3 days later, Miss Marple was sitting in her garden with Mrs. Bantry, having tea in the warm May sunshine. "I still can't believe it," said Mrs. Bantry. "A mother killing her own child. It's monstrous." "It's tragic," Miss Marple gently corrected. "Sarah Ashford was a desperate woman, trapped in a life she found unbearable. She saw Timothy as her salvation, but when he threatened to take that away, her despair turned to violence. But how were you able to figure it out?" Everyone else had equally strong reasons. It's true, everyone had their reasons. But when I considered who had the most to lose, who had invested the most emotionally in Timothy's future, the answer became clear. And then there was the diary. Sarah made a mistake by adding her own entries. She thought she did it well enough to fool everyone. But there were subtle differences. A mother knows her child's handwriting intimately, but no matter how much you practice, you can never replicate it perfectly. Poor John Ashford. He has lost both his wife and his son. Yes, he is perhaps the biggest victim in all of this. An honest man who worked hard to support his family, and who found himself caught in a web of manipulation he didn't even know existed. And the others? Mrs. Blacklock, Mr. Craddock? Mrs. Blacklock has decided to leave St. Mary Mead. She says the village holds too many painful memories now. Mr. Craddock. Well, I think he'll eventually recover. He's a sensitive man, and he was certainly manipulated by Timothy's and Sarah. But he's young. He'll find his way. Miss Price? Miss Marple smiled slightly. Miss Price is, I think, secretly pleased that her suspicions about Timothy have been vindicated, though I hope she learns that judging others so harshly can sometimes blind us to deeper truths. Raymond West appeared from the house. "Aunt Jane, I just spoke with Inspector Slack. He says Sarah Ashford has fully confessed. She will be tried in the Assisi court next month." "A tragedy from beginning to end," said Miss Marple. "An intelligent and ambitious woman, frustrated by the limitations of her time and place, who took a terrible path in her despair." "The psychology of all this is fascinating," said Raymond, who was a writer. "A mother using her son, and then killing him when he rebelled. I could write a novel about it." "Please don't, dear," Miss Marple said firmly. "John Ashford has suffered enough. He doesn't need to see his family's tragedy turned into entertainment." "Of course, Aunt Jane. You're right, as always." Later that evening, alone in her drawing-room, Miss Marple reflected on the case. She had seen so much of human nature in her years at St. Mary Mead. Love and hate, kindness and cruelty, sacrifice and selfishness. But this case had particularly moved her. Timothy Ashford had been, in a sense, both victim and villain. Molded by an ambitious mother, he had learned to see people as tools for his advancement. But he was young, and perhaps, had he lived, he would have grown beyond that cynical worldview. Now he would never know. Sarah Ashford was both perpetrator and victim. A victim of a society that offered few opportunities for intelligent and ambitious women, she had channeled all her frustrated hopes into her son. When those hopes were threatened, she committed the most unforgivable act. And everyone else involved in the case. Mrs. Blacklock with her loneliness disguised as generosity, Mr. Craddock with his misguided feelings, even Miss Price with her rigid morality, had all played roles in the tragedy. They had all seen in Timothy what they wanted to see, instead of who he truly was. Miss Marple sighed and lifted her knitting. It was an intricate pattern, requiring concentration. As her needles moved rhythmically, her thoughts quieted. The mystery of the murdered choir boy was solved. Justice would take its course. And St. Mary Mead, in time, would heal from this wound as it had healed from others before. But Miss Marple knew she would never completely forget this case, for it reminded her of a fundamental truth she had learned in her many years of observing human nature, that the most dangerous passions are often found not in obviously evil criminals, but in ordinary people pushed beyond the limits of their endurance, and that in any quiet town, beneath the seemingly respectable surface, the depths of human emotion could lead to both greatness and tragedy. Spring continued outside, indifferent to the human drama. The daffodils continued to bloom, the birds continued to sing, and life at St. Mary Mead went on. But for those who had been close to the heart of this mystery, nothing would ever be quite the same. They had seen the darkest side of human nature, and that vision, once seen, could never be completely forgotten. Miss Marple laid aside her knitting and gazed out the window at the sleeping village. Somewhere beneath those silent roofs, more secrets awaited. More passions simmered. More tragedies, perhaps, were waiting to unfold. But that would be for another day. For now, the mystery of the murdered choir boy had reached its conclusion. And Miss Marple, the gentle old lady with the razor-sharp mind, had once again fulfilled her unofficial role as the conscience and detective of St. Mary Mead. The clock's pendulum gently ticked the hours, and Miss Marple closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of rest. Tomorrow there would be roses to prune, tea to have with neighbors, and no doubt more village gossip to hear. Because life went on as it always did, and with it the eternal dance of human nature. Love and death, truth and lies, justice and mercy. And Miss Jane Marple would be there, observing, understanding, always remembering that beneath the calmest surface, the deepest currents flowed.